Hello students, welcome to week 3 and our asynchronous class lecture. So the focus of our learning will be to think about emergent literacy and thinking about the literacy development of children from birth to age 5 or before they're entering any type of formal schooling. And this type of thinking will really help support our conversation when students actually connect with text, because their literacy development is really pending upon their language development and what type of literate environment that they've come to formal schooling with, and how we can really think about assessing their language and assessing how they're interacting with text. Because prior to decoding, right, students are still developing listening and language comprehension to develop those beginning understandings, which really impact their student achievement. So how does reading begin? So oral language is the foundation for literacy and learning. And emergent literacy is a concept that supports reading as a result of the home environment. So what type of language or exposure that children have had prior to coming to school? How often have they been spoken to? What opportunities have they been given to be able to elaborate on questions, opportunities to construct language in opportunities for play? So all of that plays such a strong role on literacy development. It's something we truly have to take into consideration and communicate to all parents as educators as we're moving forward to supporting them before they enter formal schooling. So children at home also observe adults as they interact in the home. How do they interact with text? How often are they using technology to learn or get access to print? So it's not just around books anymore. It's actually around what types of exposure they are to, what type of literature are they seeing their parents access. So adults interacting with print, interacting with language. How do they speak to one another? What is the context of the conversation? And what do those interactions look like? Those really build those foundational skills for children. And they're really the critical skills that allow students to communicate with words and concepts and really connect their schema or their prior knowledge with new information. So what have they been exposed to from birth to age 5 or formal schooling prior to entering school? And then how can they use that information as they're building new knowledge and moving forward as learners? So young children, babies to age prior to toddler years, to age 2, they're really forming an ability to create the sounds that exist in language. So when we think about a small baby truly even crying to communicate and then working towards some initial even nasal sounds like and right? They're practicing babbling and cooing and making these sounds so that they can emulate sounds that they hear in language. So the more often these sounds are reinforced and the more often the interaction with young babies and children, the more likely they are to sort of connect that information to meaning when they construct words. So we know that toddlers really start formation with simple sentences, asking questions, and really thinking about how they're going to respond and have their opinions be known. So we know often that toddlers respond with no or why, because they're trying to get some type of reaction or a way to communicate as they're engaging with another person. So when we think about preschool and a lot of opportunities that exist there for students or children to interact with their peers and think about a social context for them to interact in. So how do they ask their peers questions? How do they involve each other with a type of play context? And how is their language built there? And how do they interact with some of the formal schooling structures that are developmentally appropriate? So read aloud for children and getting them to respond to a text, like laughing out loud or asking questions of the text or telling a story that relates to the text. Those are all things that we hope to support in a preschool environment as children are building new knowledge. So some of the research behind students' interaction or children's interaction with language and vocabulary development revolves around a lot of research that has been done in homes with babies who are born from birth to age 4 or 5. So how much language have they been exposed to? So during recording of time, they just simply counted the number of words that children heard. So in families with professional families where two parents are professionals or two caregivers are professionals, typically children were exposed to 2,153 words per hour versus in a working class family where blue collar workers, children were exposed to 1,251 words per hour. And in a working class or sort of low income households, 616 words per hour. So obviously these are sort of targeted homes in research, but it really gives us insight into what type of language children are being exposed to in different environments. And so it's something as educators we need to take into consideration as we are thinking about what type of instruction or what type of exposure children are going to, need to make up for some of the exposure that they may have lacked in birth to preschool to before formal schooling settings. When we think about reading development and children's exposure to print, right, we think about what are the different stages that children go through. And this is where some of the key vocabulary from chapter 4 really comes into play that you're going to want to be able to identify with in order to create your own background knowledge and foundation of knowledge with literacy development. So essentially, right, there's an awareness and an exploration with print, right? So children are typically very curious on what the little squiggles on the page mean or how books work and how they interact with books themselves. And so just out of curiosity, when we think of little children, right, we think of those thick board books, those cardboard books that often they begin just chewing on, but essentially will begin to open pages, looking at pictures, trying to construct meaning from pictures, and then thinking about engaging with some type of print, so logographic information, right? So they see the logo and they identify it with some type of meaning. So these are really pre-literate skills. So when students see McDonald's, right, they see the golden arches, the M, they say McDonald's. They're not actually reading McDonald's, but that association with that logo or logographic ability to construct meaning, right, that really is a beginning stage to literacy. Then we think about students pretending to read, reading those pictures, turning pages. How do they interact with the text? Do they flip more than one page at a time? Do they look at the pictures from back to front? So these are all assessment data points that we can consider as we are thinking about students' literacy development. And what kinds of behaviors are they starting to emulate? Are they starting to simply scribble on a page, right? Are they just making marks, right? Are they trying to make some things that might look like letters, right? So these are different developmental stages. Are they talking and writing and telling you they're making a grocery list, right? So what is it that they're doing, right? Are they able to identify their name, right? Which is really important when they see it in multiple places. So these are sort of the precursors to actually engaging with print and text before formal schooling. But we know that the expectations for students in kindergarten is that they are beginning readers, especially from January on and into first grade. They're really taking on the formal instruction that they've been provided. They're writing simple stories. They're engaging with interactive read-alouds that allow them to develop their listening comprehension. And they're really developing their ability to interact with phonics instruction so that they're having that alphabetic principle developed and they're starting to connect letters and sounds. So that really symbol system starts to come into play, and they're developing a sight word vocabulary so that they can identify between 30 and 50 sight words by the end of kindergarten and develop between 100 and 200 sight words by the end of first grade in order to build their literacy skills. Then we think about a next stage where they become transitional readers. So starting sort of the end of first grade into second grade, where they're developing some fluency with the application of the sight words that they know and being able to read with some prosody and some intonation where their reading sounds somewhat expressive, and they have developed phonics skills to be able to interact with an unknown word. So they're really doing that symbol sound association and reading across a word and being able to construct a word that they have not seen before using that letter sound symbol association. And they're really using those cognitive skills and the metacognitive strategies to be able to monitor when they come to a word they don't know, what are the steps to engage in that process? So how do I look at the beginning of the word, get my mouth ready, make the sound, and then progressively blend those sounds or chunks of words together, depending on where they are in their phonics ability, to be able to apply these skills so their reading becomes more fluent and they can take on more complex texts with more complex comprehension strategies to be able to move ahead to be independent readers in third grade. So third grade is really that marker time where we expect all of these foundational skills to come together, and they develop stamina to be reading longer text and holding on to meaning from one segment of the text to the next. So if we think about beginning chapter books with the same characters, where they engage in sometimes a different problem, there's a different conflict within each chapter that sort of builds, and that they can synthesize some type of understanding and hold on to that through the text. And think about character development, how the problem was solved. So the literary elements that they have been exposed to and practiced in K and 1 and beginning 2, towards the end of grade 2, that they really start developing it in longer text in third grade. So typically the child's writing development will be a little bit behind their reading development because there's another whole process involved, which is letter formation, being able to write unknown words. Many students will engage in a type of invented spelling so that they're writing the letters and sounds that they know and practicing that and hearing sounds throughout words and not just being able to identify them visually. But there's also a deeper context behind that where students have to actually go through developmental stages of writing to be able to communicate messages. So I talked a little bit about that as students were creating their grocery lists with scribbles, right? But essentially drawing is a beginning part of literacy development. So the scribbles on the page, sometimes you'll see students sort of talking and telling a story and just sort of moving their pencil or marker or crayon on the page, and sometimes stories that get really complex will have a lot of scribbles in them, and then you'll ask them to tell you about their story, and they will sort of talk and tell a whole story, but it's not really visually represented with any type of meaning. And then, like, there's some intentional marks, right? So it moves beyond sort of the scribbling stage to these types of marks in the page where it sort of looks like there might even be some spaces, so it seems much more intentional. And then the continuous text, right, where they're sort of moving across the page from left to right, which really emulates, right, they're imitating that way that we typically write across the page, and the return sweep. So they may not be able to identify all of the letters and sounds, but they're trying to show the return sweep as they move forward, which is a great way for us to be able to assess sort of where are they at in this literacy development. So kindergarten teachers will have to just notice how children interact with the page to be able to know what supports and interventions and what type of formal instruction that they're going to need to be able to move themselves forward. Then they sort of try to make some type of letters, right, or strings of letters, right? So they'll typically write all the letters they know without any spaces, and then they'll go across to the next line, and they're maybe drawing visually and then adding this type of writing underneath and communicating in storytelling. And then you'll notice these strings of letters hopefully will start to integrate some spacing in between. So showing you that they have some word integrity, that they see that they're constructing that there is a space between letters, right? And they're not exactly sure what they are, but they're trying to show you that, yes, I'm understanding a little bit more about how print works, and now I can represent that and construct that in writing. And then you'll notice the invented spelling or phonetic spelling, where they might write some sight words that they know, but they're typically just adding those basically the consonants that they can identify with. So more often than not, it's easier for them in phonetic spelling to write consonants that stand out more rather than those medial vowel sounds. And then they'll start to write some sight words that they know and move on to writing their names and hearing letters and sounds and some type of conventional spelling with students. So it's important that as we assess and think about the developmental stages for reading, that we think about the developmental stages in writing, because this is where they're really practicing it. So thinking about not bridging reading and writing instruction together is really a place that you're not going to want to go, because we need to be the people that take knowledge and connect it together, and that we support students in their ability to engage and do that type of work. So thinking that you're teaching reading instruction and then you're teaching writing instruction, you really need to model both of them together and integrate them as much as possible for students to make those connections with information that you're teaching them in multiple places. When we think about a literate environment, as students are thinking about, we thought about it a little bit before they enter school, but once they enter school, what does a literate environment look like, right? So at home, we know they've been exposed to print, right? We hope that they've been exposed to print, but some of this knowledge may be very limited. So in school, we need to create a space where literacy is a foundation everywhere in their life. So they see a lot of labels on things. They see signs. So the more often we can get them to connect with print, the better off they're going to be, because they're going to be practicing it multiple times. So we need to make sure that there's a print-rich environment in gathering spaces, so that we are really referring back to anchor charts, really giving students visual representation with both pictures and words, especially in kindergarten and first grade, so that they can connect meaning to print over and over again. And their student workspace, right? Those all should be filled with print-rich environments. So sometimes we will include an alphabetic strip on a student's desk, right? We give them a lot of visuals to support them. There are a lot of charts that students can go back to that they can reference and be able to visually identify things that you have said to them in an instructional way, so very purposeful talk, and then they can reference back to them like, oh, let me reference that chart. This is how we do that. This is how we decode words, right? All of the information in your room shouldn't just be pretty pictures, right? This isn't wall decor. These are things that students go back to as learners so that there is another teacher in the room. So your chart should be the voice of you represented in a visual and in a scripted way. So you want to make sure that although, as classroom teachers, we want things to be visually pleasing, but that these charts are really doing the work that you intend them to do. So if they take up space on your wall, they should be a place where you're going to really support students' engagement in that type of work. And there should be a very rich and diverse classroom library where students have texts that are windows, mirrors, and doors, right? And organized in multiple ways. So maybe organized by topic, or organized by author, or organized by some leveled, right? So some leveled text, like, so this book may be appropriate for me. These are short chapter books. These are more intricate chapter books. They can be arranged by genre, informational text, right? So as you are teaching students about books, you're also labeling and having opportunities in your classroom library where students get to engage in this type of work as they are choosing books for themselves. And they have a lot of choice around books, how long they hold on to them, when do they change them out. So all of these types of structures need to exist in your classroom. And then what does your teacher workspace look like? What types of systems and structures do you have available for you to be able to support the type of assessment that you need to collect? So formative data, anecdotal notes, right? So the notes that you take around students, do you have it in a binder? Like, what does that look like for you? What does your small group area look like? What type of resources do you need to work in that space? And how is your classroom set up to really enhance and promote student achievement? So what does your writing center look like? How have you taught students to engage with multiple resources around reading and writing? So all of these areas in your literate environment are really to promote literacy and support the instruction and the modeling that you have provide for all students, so that when they go off to practice, sort of that guided practice, so you're modeling, you're showing them what to do, you're giving a little gradual release where you are giving them the opportunity to practice what you've taught, and then finally you are moving them out of that context and really letting them be independent, and you're watching and collecting data on that growth and their interaction with the resources that you have provided. It's also important that you think about what type of activities that you're going to engage students in. So activities versus practicing skills, right? So an activity, right, can be a game or something that we teach students, right? But essentially we want the target to be about the learning and not about learning activities. So the more times we expose them to something different, right, they have to learn that context, right? So how do I play this game? How, right? And they're not really engaging with the learning. So sometimes it's essential to think about, a few activities that are sort of core activities. You model, you provide guided practice, and then you change the content in the practice. So for example, word wall practice or practicing sight words, right? You might have 3 or 4 activities that you use for maybe 8 weeks, and then you teach the students how to do them. They understand the expectations, they understand how you're going to assess that, and they understand what their role is in the learning and practicing, and then they can engage in it again and again. And these are things that you can transition in and out of as you're designing your classroom, but really thinking about not giving a different activity every time, because teaching the activity takes away from time on learning. You want to make sure that you have clear objectives and it's not just cute and fun, right? That there are clear objectives in the activity and that you have some planned outcomes, like this is how I want students to practice it. These are my expectations from my objectives, like this is what I'm going to assess when they're done with that activity. This is what I want to see that they have transferred their learning from. And we know that play is important, right? So sometimes it's hard to assess play. So we have to think about what are our objectives while we're allowing them to play and emulate, right? So if they're in a sort of a role playing of the text, so they've read a book, you're going to be the character, you choose a character, I choose a character. What is it that we're expecting to see and get out of that play? Or if they have puppets, right? What would be some assessment data that I could gather as I'm listening to play? Or if they're in a grocery store with pretend activities, right? What am I expecting students to be writing down? Or are they hearing and want to see invented spelling? How many words should they practice writing? So there should be a clear criteria around purposeful play, that they're really exploring language and then they're navigating and transferring things that you've exposed them to in sort of this play environment. So remember, literacy centers can be controversial, right? So when we're just sending them off to be independent, right, or we're sending them off to the classroom library, just go read doesn't teach reading. But when you set some clear expectations around what you're expecting to see in a center, right? What are the objectives? How are you going to assess it? What do the students understand that they're learning? Do they understand the learning target when they're there and they know what they're practicing and getting better to be able to do, and it's engaging and fun? Then a literacy center can be meaningful. But just sending them off to practice, to color, or right, those types of things don't really have clear objectives in what you're expecting to see. So remember, it's about the process, not that they do it perfectly or the outcome in a worksheet is perfect, right? Worksheets can be meaningful if there are clear objectives, but not just to keep students busy so that you can meet with small groups. Every one of your spaces in your literate environment needs to be intentional, goal-driven, and students need to understand those goals, and you need to know what the outcomes are as you're moving forward. On Thursday, we'll begin talking about different kinds of experiences in your classroom and what you're thinking of promoting for students. I look forward to seeing you on Thursday.